Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we are thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Harold Ivan Smith. Harold Ivan Smith is a thanatologist and independent scholar. For 18 years, he served on the teaching faculty of St. Luke's Hospital, Kansas City, Missouri. He also was a celebrant for Speaks Memorial Chapels, Independence, Missouri, and now for Forest Lawn Mortuary in Palm Springs, California. He has earned graduate degrees from Scarritt College, Vanderbilt University, and Asbury Theological Seminary. He has authored numerous writings on the topic of grief and published 2 academic books for clinicians. His most recent book, 2020 this year, is Almost Everything Worth Knowing About Harry S Truman. Known for his storytelling, he lives in Palm Springs, California. Harold, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Yeah, this is great. So, Harold, you appear to have dedicated your life to the field of death, dying, and bereavement care. Was there a personal death loss that inspired your professional path and writings?
Oh, yes. It's a little bit of a linked story. I'll try to tell it fast. My father worked for a company called Louisville Gas and Electric in the days before OSHA. And there was another boy in my first grade class named Johnny Rodenkamp, and we had an elderly teacher who was set for retirement, and so recess, she just let us do our thing. So every day, Johnny Rodenkamp, whose dad worked for my dad, we played Louisville Gas and Electric. So we were cutting off people's electricity and climbing poles. And, in those days, you had, after you came in, you had the nap. And so our heads were down, and somebody came into the room. And I remember Mrs. Sinkhorn, that was her real name, talking to this person. And she said, "Johnny, would you go with this lady? Take your things." And so Johnny left the classroom. And, what's that about? And then Mrs. Sinkhorn told us that Johnny's father had been killed. Now, what people did not know, and she didn't know, was that week my dad was off on vacation. And Mr. Rodenkamp had taken my dad's role on those construction crews. And in my mind, it would have been, if my dad had been there, my dad would have died. So 6 years old, I was thrust into a real quandary of how to reach out to my friend. And of course, my dad believed in taking the kids to the funeral home. So off we went to the funeral home. And I remember my dad saying, there was Mrs. Rodenkamp at the casket, because in the South you had to go up to the casket. And he said, "Tell Mrs. Rodenkamp how sorry you are." Well, I wasn't sorry. In my thinking, I was a 6-year-old. Right. And my dad nudged me. I said, "Tell Mrs. Rodenkamp how sorry you are." And I kind of buried my head into my dad's leg. And he said one more time, and 3 times was pretty unusual for my dad to say anything to a child. And Mrs. Rodenkamp intervened and said, "Mr. Smith, I'm sure he's very sorry." And my dad let it go at that. But I remember when Johnny Rodenkamp came back to class, he was the only child in our room allowed to look out the window, stare out the window for long periods of time. And sometimes I would put my head down at, nap time, and I would turn where I could watch him. And it just grew and grew on me that, boy, I can't be sorry. And then finally, Johnny just disappeared, never came back to class one day. And all these years later, I don't know what happened. And luckily, unfortunately, all the principals in that story are now deceased. And yet it was life-moving, and with one other tie. There was a man in my neighborhood who loved to tease me. I was a little kid, and I would swing around the stop sign at 24th and Howard, waiting for my dad to come home from work. And every day, Russell Johnson would pull up to the stop sign, roll down the window and say, "Butch, your dad's not coming home. He's drunk as a skunk." And I would protest, "No, no, no. Yeah, I just saw him." And then he would drive off laughing. And then I would wait for my dad to come home so I could smell his breath, because the way those men dealt with their fear of electricity and the danger was by drinking. And so consequently, I knew if you drank, you were increasing the chances of an electrocution. And more than 40 of my dad's men were electrocuted. This is long before anybody thought about OSHA. And so we always feared that someday the call was coming to our house. So rather than being afraid of death, I became fascinated. Yeah, I want to go to the funeral home. And there were times I wandered away, and they would have to lead me back to my parents, once right on the edge of going right into the embalming room. And my dad would scold me about it. But it's the way I dealt with my fear. And, death fear is such a huge issue. And so I felt like the more you know about it, the less scary it's going to be. So then I went to mortuary school and worked for a funeral home in Tennessee. And I didn't realize it. I thought I was going to work in a funeral home, be a funeral director. And then I learned the commercial side of it, and I wasn't interested in that at all. I was interested in people. But the funeral home I worked for was selling people merchandise. You got to sell. And so I just thought, no, that's not what I want. So that's the real root of my understanding of grief work. One other detail, I went to a fundamentalist church, and of course they sang at altar services, invitations to accept Jesus. And I forget how many times I accepted Jesus, but still they would often sing a song, "Are you ready for that great day?" And in my little mind, I wasn't sure. And, it was just such a scary time with the death, and yet with this hell business, and the church preached hell, scared the daylights out of me. So those were critical factors in shaping who I've become. And I still want to write a book about how hell, the idea of hell, interferes with grief. I just haven't gotten to it yet, but I really believe that's critical in people's thinking.
Yeah. Well, I can say, Harold, myself, I always say I'm a recovering Baptist, but I grew up very much in fundamentalist church, and I was terrified as a child. The whole hell thing, I was constantly worried that I had not done it the right way, right? And that was going to be my fate. So it is. I hear you there. But talking about writing, I am curious about, so your new book. I'm curious about, in your research and as you were writing this book on Harry Truman, is there anything that you came across that surprised you about Harry Truman and grief or death or those types of things?
Two things. He believed in fatalism. When it's your time to go, it's your time to go. So he survived an assassination attempt in his underwear, of all things. And he said, well, obviously it wasn't my time to go. And then in World War I, when he was running a artillery battle and they were firing, one time he moved his tent like 4 feet, and the shell landed where the tent had been. And his thinking was, it wasn't my time to go. But also, Harry Truman dug graves when he was a farmer. I think he's our only president that dug graves. Because in that little rural community, the men of the church gathered, dug the grave, and then closed the grave. And he said it was always a great experience to tell lies and foolishness, especially with summertime and you needed a little libation to make sure you were digging deep enough. Right. And but it carried over, and he had like 70 losses in his life, starting from the time he was a little boy, right on up to, one of his Secret Service agents was shot to death. And that was a horrible experience for him, because he said, when somebody has died for you, they put their life to stop a bullet. And he was so overwhelmed by it, because he's supposed to be the president, but at the same time, someone died for me. And his grandfather died. He was a banker in Kansas City, and his father died, and he's got to go back to the farm. And here he is. You've been a banker. You've been eating at great places in Kansas City, going to concerts, and now you're riding behind four mules in a field in Grandview, and that was going to be your life. Mm. Also, he and Bess married when they were older. He was 35, she was 34, and they had several miscarriages. I could not understand why they didn't have more children than just Margaret. And then I interviewed their grandson, and he told me about the miscarriages and the fear, because she was older, to be having a child in 34, and she'd had the Spanish flu the year before. So they had one child, and that was it. But her sense of loss of children was really great. And that was one of the amazing things. He wrote great condolence notes, and he went to funerals. He believed you show up at funerals. That was kind of odd. Once you're president, how do you show up for funerals? But he did every chance he could. Wow.
Yeah, it's just absolutely fascinating. And one of the things that I've appreciated about you over the years is not only your ability to write, but your ability to tell the story of what you've discovered. It's so wonderful. And I wonder if you could even talk for just a minute just about, to me, it's an art. That's an art, is not just communicating facts, but sharing it in such a way that it's compelling. And talk a little bit about, your experience with storytelling, and how did you figure out that this is what you could do that and do it effectively? And
well, I think it was about the third ADEC that I attended, and I went to seminars on all these statistics and theories and statistical derivations, and I'm sitting there going, I have no idea what the presenter has just presented about, and I wouldn't just get up and leave.
Right.
And then, I really sorted, what I know is stories, because neither of my grandfathers left me anything. They were poor men, but they were storytellers, and you'd go to their house on Saturday afternoon, and children would be seen and not heard. And so I sat and listened to the stories. One had a corncob pipe, one had a cigar. And I learned pauses. They could puff on that cigar. Well, what happened then, Granny? What happened then? I'm getting to it. I'll get to it. And so suddenly I began to say, some of these stories would be very important. And I remember sitting through a wonderful presentation on multiple homicides among African Americans. And it was terrific. And so afterwards I spoke and I said, is there some reason you didn't include Martin Luther King? And the presenter said, what are you talking about? I said, well, Dr. King was killed. His mother was killed 5 years later. The King children saw that shooting. Two of his nieces and nephews dropped dead while jogging. Their uncle, only surviving uncle, drowned under mysterious circumstances a year after Dr. King. And I said, that family is a walking, grieving family. Right. And this was news to the presenter. And I said, for some of us, we just need, the theory is great, but give us a story we can hang on to, or we can take that away. Like I've often told the story about Harry Truman being the only griever. They had announced, it was an elderly man, they had shipped the body back to Independence. And nobody came to the funeral, nobody came to the visitation. But they did announce that graveside would be at 2:00. And of course, elderly people sometimes showed up at the grave. Right. And so it was snowing, it was cold, and the minister said to the funeral director, let's bury this guy and get out of here. Nobody's going to come. And the minister paused and he said, let's wait till 2:00. And I tell you what, if nobody's here at 2:00, I'm just going to do the Lord's Prayer and call that a service. So sure enough, they're trying to keep warm, getting ready for the service. And all of a sudden they see this Chrysler come into that section of the cemetery. And Dr. Thomas Melton is going, oh my God, oh my God. And so he starts away from the tent and is heading toward the car. The car pulls up and an elderly gentleman is trying to get out. And Dr. Melton says, no, stay in place, stay in place. And finally he shifted his body against the door and said, roll down the window. I'll do the service from here. he did a very lickety-split service and then leaned in the car and said, "Mr. President, what are you doing here?" And Harry Truman pointed to the grave and said, "I was with that man in France. I never forget a friend." And Dr. Melton, who was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church, said, "I would have had to resign the church and leave town if they had buried that guy and Harry Truman showed up." But that was a key thing. I go to funerals, but he was elderly by this time. And some of us, I have a picture of him being a pallbearer. And you go, Lord. And I went up the steps. I went to see the steps, and I went, oh my gosh, how did he do this? Well, he was asked, and you serve when you're asked to do things like that. And that he was the only. So I've told people, even if there's only one person there, that person may well need to be there. Matter of fact, on Good Friday, the toughest service I've ever had to do, was in a cemetery in the rain during COVID. There was only one person there. That was the daughter of the deceased. I got soaking wet. Water was running off the casket. And this poor lady was just beside herself. How can we not have anybody here? Well, it's the rules of the cemetery. And I was just like, God, you got to help me, help this lady. And she had an umbrella. They didn't set up a tent. I don't know what that was about. There was supposed to have been a tent. And I was trying to reach out, and I didn't get the call to do the service till Wednesday night. And this was Friday morning. But I thought, I'm going to do my best to give her mother a very solid funeral. And then I was castigated for taking too long. We're only going to do this once, and it was just different. And it came out of the cemetery wet and took a shower to get warmed up. And I'm just going, that was strange. We shouldn't be doing rituals this way.
Yeah.
And that's been the universal story of count 10. And in some large families, you got 30 cousins, and you get 10 total. And I think we're going to have what I call ritual scars or ritual wounds.
Because these limitations that we put in place, right?
Absolutely.
And that to say you only get 10 minutes, it was tough. Now, luckily, this daughter was pleased, but I was not pleased. Like, what is this about?
It can be life-altering for the grieving.
Yes.
On how their loved one is remembered in the final moments.
Yes. And I've listened to these people who the nurse held up a phone. They were in intensive care. And this sense of, I should have been there with them or for them. And then grandchildren, some young children who weren't allowed those last moments to say goodbye. And then because of 10 count, we're going to go with adults. We've got some really significant issues coming with children who were excluded.
Yeah, very much. And we don't know yet the long-term impact or effect or what they carry with them. Because as you know, kids are inquisitive. There's all sorts of things. We don't know what's going on in their mind and what they're thinking about, whatever that situation was. We just don't know. Yeah. And they're thinking about it like a little kid, like a child thinks about it.
I see anger. I see regrets of not being able to, have the closure that they wanted to have. So these still unresolved issues. I agree. I think it's going to be impacting a lifelong journey, and not in a positive way.
No. And for some people, there can be like a false guilt. And I have with a few pushed and said, can you tell me what more you could have done? And and I tell them, you can always convene a grand jury and indict yourself. You wouldn't indict anyone else in the family, but you know where to get at you. And would you agree with me that you'll try to limit that? And I have said to some, I just want to tell you something. I hope, not having family, when my time comes to go, there will be someone who shows as much kindness to me as you showed to your loved one. And I don't say that lightly, because I've thought a lot about not having family, but it's part of the realities of today. But that false guilt, and children believe this. I misbehaved, or I didn't clean up my room, or whatever. And the families that don't allow children to talk and to grieve openly, where that's the antecedent, Dr. Bill Wharton says, that just starts percolating. And eventually the lid is rattling, and they'll go, oh, that was a long time. I was just a little kid. Yeah, but your memory wasn't a little kid. You recorded those experiences. Yeah.
And I remember as a child, I was told, oh, well, they went away. And I'm like, well, when are they coming back? Well, they're in a better place. Well, I want to go there too. I just didn't understand. But one of the things that we at Heal Grief really, really try to emphasize is kindness to oneself.
Yes. And that's a great phrase to say. I wish we had T-shirts and bumper stickers. You'd be driving in traffic and see.
Be kind to yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can only control what we can control.
And to get that point across with some type A grievers.
Yeah.
And I've heard that there must have been something more I coulda, should have done. And I think it's important to listen to that, but also at the same time say, I think you did more than a lot of people would have done.
Yeah.
But
I had a counselor years ago who worked for me in one of the centers I ran, and she used to say, and I think she just really hit the nail on the head, is that quite often people do the woulda shoulda because in their mind they think that whatever could have happened other than what happened would be a better alternative.
Yes.
To what happened. And the reality is we don't know that. It could have been even worse. We just don't know, but we always in our mind think that somehow that would have been better had I done this or had I done that. And without really any evidence, it's just sort of a natural human tendency to want to go back and control that somehow.
And I think we're going to see that with a lot of healthcare workers. I did a consult recently, and in intensive care units, the nurses saying, we've never seen this many deaths in a year. And yet now, and it's kind of like, I can't deal with this. My whole year has been condensed down, and we're so busy. It's like on to the next patient.
Right.
Nurses and doctors, the whole ramification, we're not trained for that. And eventually some are going to need to say, I need to revisit this season of my life. It's I think of some of these, since my mother died in a nursing care center, I was so pleased with that wonderful Jamaican lady who took care of my mother and could be so wonderful to my mother, even when my mother was being a tough patient. But, doing it, the woman's not getting rich, barely above minimum wage, probably. And those individuals, and I think a lot of people are going to fall through the cracks. And that troubles me enormously. And I've been looking at this family in New Jersey where I think I've got it right. Grandma died, and now 3 or 4 aunts or uncles have died. And all these children in the family, how is it going to react in future family reunions if they do that? Or was grandma possibly the glue that held that family together?
Right. Does it disconnect them in some way?
Yes. Yeah. And I just can't imagine what it would be like. Almost, I keep going back to Johnny Rodenkamp. No way to reach out to him. I mean, I was just a little kid, and I couldn't find a way to reach out to him. But I think he was a mirror to say, this could happen to me. This really could happen to me. My dad could be. And my dad fell several times off telephone poles and had back injuries and that sort of thing, but was never electrocuted.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Harold, we actually only have a few minutes left, but I know our time flies when we're having these great conversations, and
time flies when you're talking about death.
Yeah, exactly. It just does, doesn't it? So I did want to give an opportunity, though. Quite often, folks who watch Let's Talk Death, they like to know how they can connect with our guests.
Yeah.
How might they do that? How might they connect with you and your work?
There's two ways. One, all of my books are on Amazon.com. And the second way is just contact me at my email, haroldIvansmith@gmail.com. It's all one word, haroldIvansmith@gmail.com. Harry Truman had his phone number in the the white pages in those days.
Really?
And I thought, well, if Harry Truman can do that, I ought to be. And he often answered the phone himself at the Presidential Library. And he'd go, "This is the old man speaking. What can I help you with?" And you go, "This is Harry Truman on the phone." So yeah, that's a great way to contact me.
That's great. Harold, we want to thank you so much for being a guest here at Let's Talk Death and for sharing your journey and your work and the story of Harry Truman. Thank you so much. It's been so delightful.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course.
Yes, and thank you to those who are joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you'd like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about our programs and resources that we have here at Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults. It's a program that we call Actively Moving Forward.
Make sure to sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for links to future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
And so again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Let's Talk Death.